Okay, I know Jack wants to talk to you a little bit about the next setting, but I don't see him in the room, so maybe we can do that right before lunch. Let me point out that you have now used up 20 minutes of your 15-minute break. Well done. Well done. So. Oop. All right. Let's see if we can jump back in the conversation, because where we left it was, this tension between the aspirations and the outcomes, and the fact that we are actually not encouraged to have outcomes. It just is not in our DNA, as in so many nonprofits, as I've been saying. So let me offer an operational definition of an outcome. And an outcome for the church is the difference that you believe God has called you to make in this next chapter of your life. Now, when we were working on this metrics project at TMF, this was one of the places that the conversation went to, trying to come to terms with what then is an outcome. Is it just another goal? And in fact, we tend to treat goals as additives. What are we going to do next? What's our next goal? Well, the next goal assumes that what you've been doing is already faithful and accurate. And so we are trying to find a way to ask a different question and to put some limits, some boundaries on it. Because if we are an aspirational people, one of the things about aspirations is that they tend not to operate with a lot of boundaries. And so what is the boundary that can help us to get closer to developing an outcome? So we talk about an outcome is the difference that you believe God has called you to make, an intentional difference. One of the things a lot of our congregations have done is that they've been able to point to the difference that happened without being aware of whether they were causative in any form. And so often we have kind of moved in ministry encouraged by the differences or the changes that we see around us that may at best been serendipitous. Is there in fact an intentional change? And the thing about intentional change, it means that you as a leader have to be somewhat diagnostic. You have to be willing to know, to start a conversation, to say, here's something that doesn't quite fit. This is what Ron Heifetz would call the adaptive gap. And the adaptive gap is simply the difference between what we say about ourselves and how we actually behave. And our congregations quite often are ripe with adaptive gaps. At its simplest, how many do you know, congregations do you know that are warm and loving? And their behavior would suggest something else. They're hospitable. They are missional. I mean, we use all the, but we don't actually say what would that mean. And so what we're talking about now is beginning to shape that difference. What is the difference that you believe God has called you to make? And here we're talking about purpose, not preference. Let's go back to that idea of the old linear models of leadership that we used to have. Way back when I was a young man, had hair and only half the waist. Strategic planning happened on Saturday afternoon once a year, when you took everybody into the basement of the church and you asked the planning question, what do you want to do next year? And then you would get out the newsprint and put up all 473 ideas for these 20 people to work on. And then too many, so you'd go and you'd put a star or a check on. But do you hear what happened with the first question? What do you want to do next year? Preference. It was a preference question. It was not a purpose question. It was not asking, what is God calling you to do? It's asking, what would you like to, and quite often what we did is we used that kind of linear thinking to build more comfortable congregations. Now, you do know, I hope, that I'm overstating the case in order to make a point. that along with that were also some very thoughtful conversations, some very missional conversations, some conversations that really talked about the community of the people who were in the church and the community that was surrounding the church. So please don't hear me denigrating everything, but what I'm trying to say is that our linear thinking was taking us down a preferential path. And if we're going to set outcomes, I want to encourage you as leaders not to be caught in the preference of the people. Of course they want their preference. So do I. I can't tell you how many congregations I have helped change their worship in a direction that made me know I hoped I never had to attend. But it wasn't about me.
Right.
It was about, can God speak to this community? So how do we help shape our outcomes so that it's a difference that is purposeful? God's called you to make it in this next chapter of your life. When I'm talking with congregations, the planning cycle that I tend to think about more than anything else is 3 to 5 years. Because if you come up with a clear outcome, there's at least a year in there in terms of startup. Just to get yourself and your people aligned with what you're trying to do. And then you've got a couple of years to work at it. But after a couple of years, you're going to have to ask the outcome question again. What does God call us to now? If I'm working with an annual conference, the cycle is 4 to 8 years. Not just because of the quadrennial pieces, but because it takes that much longer for any annual conference to have a startup cycle and to get any kind of alignment. And think of what that means when your annual conference changes your priority every 4 years. Friends, that's known as work avoidance. They're pleasant conversations that are guaranteed not to upset anybody. So we need time limits on our outcomes. We need to say, what's next? Who are we now? As a people who are involved with the eternal grace of God, we've got to get it broken down. And that is a primary task of leadership, to lead conversations in that way. How are we doing? Does that make sense? Okay, so what I'm trying to say here, and we're going to go into 2 different directions, this is really asking us to proceed with our leadership in an area in which we have to develop some different sensitivities. One of the things that I want to argue is that if we're going to move toward this kind of an outcome, we have to learn how to use an outcome language instead of a process language. People who are always concerned about what they are doing, a gerund, a verb, their activities, tend to talk in terms of process. And we need to be able to talk in terms of outcomes. Ooh, that didn't show up too well. Just take my word for it, that's a great slide.
Gil, are these slides available online or anything?
Yes. Oh, no, not online, but someone asked me, and I volunteered Jack. I will send them to Jack, and then if you want a copy, all right? Yeah, and if that helps to remember the conversation. But the folks who work on these outcomes, and here I was working with the materials that came out of the Rensselaer Institute, but they point out the difference in the language between outcomes and process. And I'd like you to just listen to this, because when we're talking about questions of process, we really are talking about identifying resources and activities. Again, the familiarity of this language with the church. Let me give you a sequence of 3 questions about an organization that follow a process frame. The first question, what does your organization do? Do you hear it? Simply by its construct, it's asking about your activities. What does your congregation do? Well, okay, here, what does your organization do? The answer is we provide services to low-income residents of our community. I'm just drawing off the resource that's in the back of the book here. What does your organization do? We provide services to low-income residents of our community. What kinds of services? Still an activity question. We provide group and individual family counseling. How many people do you serve? That's an activity question. Last year, we provided 500 counseling hours to 125 families. Do you hear all the process? Okay. Do you realize is if the only thing you have is a process conversation, you can set your goals for next year to be able to provide 600 hours to 147 families, at which point we know that we can guarantee that you will be more tired and feel better and not know whether you made any difference in the lives of those families.
Thinking back to the Deming model, if input are nouns, throughput are verbs, what are outcomes?
I'm simply describing them as differences. What is the fundamental difference? Now you can actually take the input, throughput, and outcome, and you can add a little bit to it, which will make some finer distinctions. We're just going to stay with this for the moment. But I'd like you to think about, and outcomes quite often can be expressed as resources or verbs. But they have to note a clear difference. In here, what we're not talking about is a difference. We did 500 hours with 125 activities. That is a perfect description of an activity. It didn't say if anything was different because of what we did. If we had an outcome conversations tend to lead to identify intentional differences. Again, a sequence of questions that are offered here. Instead of asking, what does your organization do? The first question might be, what is your organization hoping to accomplish? Now, that may feel like a simple shift in language. But friends, why does the church pay attention to language as much as we do, except that we know language shapes behavior? The vocabulary that we choose determines who we're going to be. And so, what is your organization hoping to accomplish? Well, we're working to improve the parenting skills of abusive families. Do you hear that they've already identified a difference? We want families that do not abuse their children. That's a difference we want in this community. What kinds of skill improvement are you working toward? Well, we want reductions in use of corporal punishment and increases in use of positive reinforcers of good behavior, among others. Do you hear what just happened there? They know the difference that they're after. And so for the coming year, what level of results would make the year a success? Not how much work did you put in, but what level of results. For the coming year, we're working to improve parenting behavior in 200 families as measured by the use of corporal punishment or the use of reinforcement of good behavior. One of the things that we learned in this metrics project is that we have been overly anxious about metrics. And if you get clear enough in your outcome and you can actually describe the difference you're trying to make, the metrics tend to produce themselves. Once we know that our outcome is to change the behavior of families from corporal punishment to reinforcing good behavior, the metrics are not hard to figure out. You just measure how many times kids got hit and how many times kids got encouraged. And those are quantifiables. So right now, my argument would be, as a church, we are much too worried about measuring things without knowing what we're trying to measure. If we get the difference clear, then the metrics are going to come along with it. Does that make sense? We okay? So part of what I'm trying to say here is that clearly we need to learn as leaders, we need to learn how important our language is as we invite people into conversations. The questions that we use will shape the conversation we're going to have. Yes, ma'am.
Can you give some examples of some outcome-oriented questions in the church?
Sure. Can I give some examples of outcome-oriented questions in the church? Absolutely. Who's got one?
What will make this year a success?
Yeah, okay. One may be what may make this year a success. That might be a step in that direction. Keep going, friends. What else do you have?
What is this ministry hoping to accomplish?
What do you think?
Whatever the ministry, you can name the ministry. What is this soup kitchen? What is this choir? What is this small group? You fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
What is it hoping to
Yeah.
accomplish?
What is the purpose of our new edition?
Yeah. Oh, you know, what differences are new? The thing, see, thanks, Chris. I like not to talk about that. The dilemma with, and this, you've tagged something in me. I've worked with so many churches that have put property online without knowing what purpose it was to serve.
Yep.
And so the reason I responded the way I did is I would much prefer to work with a congregation that got clear about its purpose, that helped them to realize they needed a facility to fulfill that purpose. I can't tell you how many churches I've known who have built or renovated with a hope that it would be attractive, and then have to figure out what are we going to do with that space now. So the order in which we ask some of these questions can be terribly important as well. But keep going with the questions.
Well, in our group, we were talking about how you were measuring, the community, the church was measuring like how many people came. So then once new people came and more people came, they were just complaining that they weren't doing the activities that they wanted. So they were still focusing on what you were saying were resources and activities. So first it was like we don't have enough people. Now we have people, but they're not doing the activities like it. And so I think this is helpful because what if we said, okay, what's our, the activity that new people didn't want to do at the yard sale? Well, what's the outcome of the one of the yard sale? Well, the outcome was that yard sale always produced money for missions. Well, then new people can get behind wanting to help a mission, but maybe they don't want to do a yard sale. But as a pastor, that's helpful because then I can say, see, we're helping the mission in a different way.
Right.
Instead of getting always caught up in those activities.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've struggled with is that we do continue to invite more and more people, which will strengthen the activities that we are already doing. What if the conversation got changed? Don't think about what we said last night from those two young people from Harvard, that there are 6 themes: community, you know, personal transformation, social transformation. At what point do we ask ourselves, what is it that we are asking people to join that will address this question that they have about transforming their own lives? I mean, you know, I had a sidebar conversation about a church that has a daycare center. And after a period of time and using that daycare center, one of the things that they're very, very aware of is that at no point did any of the parents or the kids ever drift into the church. Okay, and if your leaders are concerned about that, may I suggest that you're concerned about your church, not about those kids and not about the parents. But you can ask the same question by saying, now that we have these kids here, if we offered parenting classes to help them become better parents, because that's why we're here, would they want to participate in those kinds of activities because it is trying to answer their question, not our question? Do you hear how it gets reversed a bit? Tom, you were going to go someplace.
Yeah, so to generalize that, you're saying maybe a question would be like, what would changed lives look like in our neighborhood 1 year from now?
Yeah.
Or what would our high school students at our high school look like to you? What changes?
Yeah, what is the change in the life of the people in this community that we would like to see that we have some capacity to address? Now we can start to say, here's something we can start to work on. Good question here and then there.
How about asking on a Sunday morning, how many of you did what the sermon said last Sunday?
Okay, how many, let's do it this way. How many are bold enough to ask the question, how many of you did what the sermon talked about last week?
Or how about how many of you even remember what the sermon said?
How many of you were here last Sunday?
And how many of our preachers could rehearse it without their notes? Is that an outcome question? And if so, why? If not, why?
It's an activity.
It's an activity question.
But if the outcome is transformation. And if the point of your sermon is transform life, and if there's an action piece that are saying this week, the scriptures tell us to love
Sure,
our neighbor.
sure.
I think we need to ask them when they come back the next week, did you love your neighbor?
Yeah, do we have any expectation of accountability for people, you know,
Of
and
course,
right.
next week.
And so, and I accept that. What I'm trying to say, though, is that, you know, we cannot frame people's behavior in such close ways to say that you all must be doing the same. Let's go this way quickly. We have often thought about pastoral care as helping people in difficult times, or helping people to develop, or helping people to form. And the way in which we have practiced pastoral care in a highly relational system is through nurture and support. But if you go to the early church fathers, they won't talk about pastoral care, they'll talk about the cure of souls. And in the cure of souls, if you want to be in that pastoral relationship, if a person needs support, you support them. If a person needs encouragement, you encourage them. If a person needs correction, you correct them. Do you hear what just happened? We crossed over the relational boundary. But the bigger point was, nowhere in the care of souls was it done in a community. It was done individually. So when you begin to think about the behavior of the people in your congregation, you really can't make statements about how we all must do A, B, or C. All of those things may be part of the disciplines of the United Methodist Church or of the Christian lifestyle, and so we want to make sure people understand these various paths. But the corrector, or the support, is for people to take their own directions. And so we have to be very careful about how uniform we want to make a lot of our communities.
I don't know if this is, or help me understand, it seems like these outcome questions, is it just for the church, or is this an invitation to be vulnerable and ask beyond the church? So is this an opportunity for community to say, you are part of this outcome, so what could the outcome be? Or is this just church?
I thought you'd never ask. One of the other things that I want to say is that if we have to learn how to change our language, we have to learn how to be sensitive to the context in which we're trying to answer these questions. One of the things that happened was that in this conversation that's been going on over these past number of years, a lot of our leaders have come to the point that they realize that the congregation itself is not the object of our ministry. We are not called to minister to the church. The church is a resource in which we are to minister to the mission field. We okay so far? A lot of conferences I go to now, the bishops and the appointive cabinet no longer make appointments to congregations. They make appointment to the mission field. The assumption is, and the hope is, that people will start to learn that the congregation is an instrument of ministry to that place. But the mission field also has the interior aspect. So the mission field can be both inside your church and outside your church. Let's go back to that simple example. You've got a governing board that is so confrontational that they can't have a conversation. So civility is an act of discipleship. That's an internal mission field that you ought to be setting outcomes for. You got a congregation that can't talk about anything except itself. You need to be able to help it learn some of the disciplines of the church, like intercessory prayer, where it learns how to think about somebody else every once in a while. Some things are going to have to happen inside, but there's also the external mission field, in which you're going to have to be willing also to ask, what is it that God has placed us here for, and what difference will we make? So let's play with it a little while here. Familiar verse, Acts 1, verse 8, but you receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. What I was saying to you before is that leaders need to know the language that they're using when they're talking to their congregation about their purpose. You also need to know the location of your congregation when you're talking about that. So let's play it this way. Jerusalem, you shall be my witness in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is us. It's the folk who are already inside. Jerusalem are the people we not only recognize as being like us, but we know their names, we know their stories. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to tell you them. We know these people intimately. And sometimes, quite frankly, this is where our outcomes need to be, because we've got people who are not seeking discipleship in our congregations. So sometimes our ministry has to be in Jerusalem itself. There is Judea, which is people who are like us, but they're not us. These are people that we would recognize if they came in, and in fact, we like to welcome them in. And when they come in, we're pretty comfortable with us, but we don't know their names yet. We're not sure whether they have dogs or cats. We have to find that out. But we're pretty comfortable in doing ministry with them. And for these folks, we would even be willing to adjust some of our practices if it made them a little bit more comfortable. How are we doing? We okay so far? Samaria is quite different, though. Samaria is the area of difference. These are the people who are so unlike us. And this is not just in terms of race or ethnic background or socioeconomic. This also has to do with our values. It has to do with our cultural assumptions. These are people who are so different they feel dangerous. We would have to learn how to be a very different church in order to engage these people. But these people may also be the mission field surrounding us. Do you hear where we are, friends, here?
Like the church you grew up in.
Like the church the church I grew up in is now deeply located in Samaria. Yeah. I really am trying to help us get to the point that when I argue with you that leadership is conversation, that you need to be at least aware enough to know what conversation you're inviting people into. And so are you asking people to talk about resources or activities or outcomes? Are you wanting people to talk about process or outcomes? Do you want people to talk only about the people who are already there, or the people who are like you that could come, or this foreign territory in which you need to know which of these conversations you want to have because it is appropriate for your congregation. And friends, let me introduce you to the word appropriate. It is one of the key words for leadership. Please do not have a conversation that belongs to somebody else. That is not a good reason to read a book and to take somebody else's conversation into your congregation unless the book describes your situation. If the book describes your situation, it's a good tool because it's safer for people to start talking about the book than talking about themselves. And so you can get them from the book to themselves, but don't take the conversation you want them to have that you found in the book if it doesn't belong to them. This is your task as a leader. How are we doing? We okay?
Can you flesh that out some more? I'm not real clear.
Sure. Who can flesh that out for Mark?
Well, taking Ginghamsburg's books and applying them to your situation as if it's a complete identification.
Yeah. And this is happening quite a bit, where you're looking at some other church or you're looking at somebody else's writing and you say, boy, I wish we could do that, and so you try to install it. Or you might be in a very, very ripe mission field, a Samaritan mission field, but you're so comfortable and the people are so comfortable that it would be a disjunctive conversation. So you're going to have to ask yourself, how will we get there? But again, we're back into this idea of you being a certain diagnostician as part of your discernment in terms of leading the church.
So this is the question that's floating in my mind. As individual churches, we might not be this model yet, but perhaps we are this model as a cluster of churches. Around our church, within an 8-mile radius, there are 14 United Methodist churches. If we're not at this model, but we find that we as a cluster have reached this model, is that sufficient, or do we continue to pursue this model?
Oh, no. From my perspective, that's more than sufficient, because the Church of Jesus Christ is a church for all people and for all places. But every church is not. What I'm after here, friends, is that this is not a model where I would assume that your congregation has to have outcomes and mission both in all of Judea, all of Jerusalem, all in Judea, and all Samaria. I don't know congregations that do that. And if they do, they're very large because, and let me go to this really quickly. It takes a relatively large, resource-rich congregation to have more than 2 outcomes. Outcomes are not the same thing as action steps. I once did a strategic planning process with a congregation, and I asked them to see their former strategic plan, which had 45 action steps. They felt good about all the planning that they did, and they accomplished 3 of them. Our capacity is to work at a much lower level. So what I'm asking you here is not, does your congregation hit all 3 rings? I'm asking you, in which ring does your congregation currently live, and what is the conversation it needs to have? What should be different because of where you live in this mission field?
So it sounds like what you're saying is that setting outcomes is very contextual. It's about what can this church or this ministry do in this community? What difference can it make in this community at this particular time?
You bet.
So how do you then also maybe lead upwards? Because if you're talking in your congregation, you have a sort of control over how that conversation plays out to an extent. But then you also have, since we're in the middle of charge conference season, you have call to action goals or things like that that are set that aren't really outcomes, like you're saying, about how are you going to increase average worship, how are you going to increase members and money and mission and all those kinds of things. So how do you also help frame that conversation upwards just like you would in your congregation?
Right. Right. And again, as much as we are all part of the same body, and the fact that our annual conference in General Church has some action plans or some call to action and so forth, friends, I want you to hear that as proximate outcomes for the General Church. General Church is trying to figure its path along here as well, and so I can tell you it doesn't matter which annual conference I go to, or even if I'm working with Presbyterians or Reformed Jews or even Roman Catholics, they will still tell me that their proximate outcomes are vital congregations, leadership development, new church starts, connecting with the community, and a focus on discipleship. Those are the leading 5. And so your conference is going to be asking you to work in those areas. And I really want you to work in those areas when it aligns appropriately with who you are and what you're called to do. The word appropriate again. I used to, when I was preaching in my last church, I had one layman, a friend of mine, who would come out, and every single Sunday he would say, "Oh, Gil, that was really appropriate." And he did that enough times, and I finally said, "Andy, you have to understand how disappointing that is. I wasn't trying to be appropriate, I was trying to be memorable." And he actually shook his finger at me. He says, "No, you don't understand. You can't get better than appropriate, because appropriate means you said what could be heard. If you had said less, it wouldn't have helped. If you had said more, it wouldn't have mattered." Our leadership has to be appropriate. Yes, your denomination is going to ask you to pay particular attention to some things. And as appropriate, please do so. But you're there in the local setting of ministry to ask yourself, what is it that God calls us to make different here in the next 3 to 5 years? Which is a very different question. So, let me invite you to go back to your table for about 15 minutes or so and just talk about where you are. Where has your congregation already set clear, intentional, purposeful, time-limited outcomes to guide your ministry? I don't have the assumption that you aren't somewhere in this conversation at all. You might be working on this. So where is it? And then secondly, or alternately, depending upon how you want to approach this, do you have an example of an outcome that you want your congregation to consider? Is there a conversation you want them to have? So take about 15 minutes and play with this, and then we're going to do one more thing before lunch.